Hello, AP Bio. Welcome to a video lecture that I am entitling Selections from Chapter 25, The Origin and Diversification of Eukaryotes, Chapter 26, The Colonization of Land by Plants, and Chapter 27, The Rise of Animal Diversity. So for this chapter, I picked a picture of Jack. He's about 2 in this picture, and he is clearly in distress. He is clearly upset about something. I believe in this picture he wanted to be outside, and we were not going outside, so he was not in a good mood. And I picked that picture because you might feel the same way about looking at us potentially covering 3 chapters in one video. But let me explain, because this is not going to be that difficult. So these 3 chapters in the book essentially are a pretty extensive survey of the 4 eukaryotic kingdoms. So protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And a large part of these 3 chapters is classification. So like classifying all the types of protists, classifying all the types of plants, going through all the phyla of animals, from sponges to crabs to sea urchins to humans. And that kind of classification stuff is not on the AP exam. They don't expect you to know a bryophyte versus a gymnosperm, for example. So, you know, if you're a kid that loves animals and wants to read all about the different types of snails, read chapter 27. It's fantastic. But I don't want to spend that much time going through all of these 3 chapters when that stuff is not going to be on the AP exam. So what I have done is I picked selections from these 3 chapters. The stuff that I've selected could be on the AP exam. This is stuff that you do need to know, but a lot of the details in these 3 chapters we're largely going to skip. Okay, so let's do it. So, you know, chapter 24 that we just did was on bacteria. So 25 starts with kingdom Protista, Protist Characteristics. So again, let me just say again, everything that we're doing in these 3 chapters is eukaryotic. So we're done with prokaryotes. So kingdom Protista is a very diverse group. It's actually paraphyletic, and what that means is that all the protists, all the things that we put in kingdom Protista, they don't go back to a single common ancestor that diverge into all the protists. Protists basically have arisen different times in different lineages. Your textbook actually argues that there should probably be like 10 different kingdoms for protists because they're so diverse. We're not going to do that. This slide goes through some general characteristics of all protists. So they're mostly single-celled. Think like an amoeba or algae. Seaweeds are multicellular. There are exceptions. They're all eukaryotic. Likely the first eukaryotes to evolve from prokaryotes are things that we would put in kingdom Protista. They're most all aerobic. They most all use oxygen. A lot have flagella or cilia at some point, which tells you that most of them live in the water. They do versions of mitosis. Lots of variety there, but they do have some mechanism that uses a spindle and stuff like that. The earliest fossils of eukaryotic cells, which we would put in kingdom Protista, are about 1.8 billion years old. Remember, bacteria first appeared 3.5 billion years ago. So for 1.7, close to 2 billion years, the only life on Earth was bacterial, and then we get eukaryotic cells, things that we would put in Protista today. So there's 3 main categories of protists. Again, the textbook goes through examples of each type. We're just going to go through what they are. So algae are protists that are plant-like. Plant-like in that they do photosynthesis. There are no single-celled plants. So if you're a single-celled thing that does photosynthesis, you're a protist. Things like diatoms, these are things that live in the ocean, usually the top couple centimeters where there's lots of sunlight. Protozoa are animal-like protists, so think like an amoeba. They're animal-like in that they don't have chloroplasts. They have to ingest food like an amoeba. Again, there are no single-celled animals. So if you're a single-celled thing that does things animals do, like ingest food, you're a protozoa. The word protozoa means first animal. They're not animals, so think of proto as before animals. Fungus-like protists, like a slime mold, which is what's pictured here, they mainly live by absorption of nutrients. They grow on things that are dead or decaying. And again, if you want to know examples of each type in more detail, look in chapter 25. Just some pictures. Here's a nice parasitic protist. Here are diatoms again. They usually have cell walls made of silica, so light can go through them because they have chloroplasts. Yep, that looks fantastic. Volvox is a multicellular freshwater type of algae. They look like little soccer balls that swim around. Really cool. And here's an amoeba. Amoebas move, they have the big pseudopods where they can move through cytoplasmic streaming and they can ingest. I bet this amoeba is going to ingest this little algae right here. So one thing that 25 mentions, and we talked about this back in like chapter 4, I think, is the theory of endosymbiosis. So this should sound familiar, but this is so important and we're going to hit it again. So if you look at the DNA of eukaryotic cells, they're called combination organisms because they contain genes that are also found in genes that are found in domain bacteria and genes that are found in domain archaea. All right, so it's like a mix of the two different types of prokaryotic cells together, and the evidence for that goes back to the endosymbiotic theory. And this was the theory that eukaryotic cells came from a symbiotic mutual relationship where the ancestors of mitochondria and chloroplasts today were once free-living bacterial-like things. They were ingested by the ancestor of eukaryotic cells, probably to eat them. They didn't eat them because, you know, ancestral mitochondria provides you energy and ancestral chloroplast provides you food. And that's where eukaryotic cells came from. So this is from your book that just goes through, like if you look at eukaryotic cells, DNA replication enzymes or archaeal transcription enzymes or archaeal, you know, you can read this yourself. You have genes in common with both domain bacteria and domain archaea. Serial endosymbiosis is the idea that the precursor mitochondria was engulfed before the precursor of chloroplast. Serial, the word, you know, like a TV series has episodes, things happen in like stages. And the evidence for this, so more types of cells have mitochondria than chloroplasts. All cells have mitochondria except bacteria. Only plants and algae have chloroplasts. So if the chloroplast was engulfed first, and that line evolved to us, we would have had to lose the chloroplast at some point, which that breaks the concept of maximum parsimony, where the fewest number of events that have to happen is probably the evolutionary scheme that's correct. This is just the same picture bigger. So the idea is that your ancestral prokaryote engulfed an aerobic bacterium. That means that it was a bacteria that could do aerobic respiration. So it's the precursor mitochondria. Big mistake. A lot of times kids on essays will say that an ancient prokaryote engulfed a mitochondria. No. You won't get the point if you say it that way. You can say they engulfed a ancestor or a precursor of the mitochondria. And then this line is the ancestor of animals and fungi. Later, one of these things engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium like blue-green algae, like cyanobacteria. Remember, those exist today. And that line evolved into modern-day plants and protists, okay? This idea, serial endosymbiosis, the endosymbiotic theory, is incredibly important. The AP exam loves asking about it, so make sure you know this really well. We already said this, so why is this mutualism? Well, the mitochondria provide energy using oxygen, so the thing that engulfs them has more ATP. The chloroplast provides sugars using CO2, and of course the cell that engulfs them, well, you know, they're getting the energy in the glucose. The ancestral mitochondria and chloroplast have housing, you know, they have protection, so both benefit. Mitochondria likely arose first. The plastid lineage that things have chloroplast evolved later. Key evidence. So the evidence is really telling. I'm going to give you a bunch of evidence. You should be able to spit out 3 of these in an essay on a test, at least. So mitochondria and chloroplast, about the same size as modern day bacteria. Mitochondria and chloroplast both have inner membranes similar to the plasma membranes of bacteria, like in what enzymes are in them. Mitochondria and chloroplast can divide on their own, right? Other organelles can't do that, right? And they divide by a process similar to binary fission, which is what bacteria do. Mitochondria and chloroplast also contain their own DNA in the form of circular chromosomes, just like a bacteria. Mitochondria and chloroplasts also contain their own ribosomes. They can make their own proteins, and they're similar in size to prokaryotic ribosomes, which are smaller than eukaryotic ribosomes. And if you sequence the chromosome, the DNA in mitochondria and chloroplasts, and compare it to bacteria, there are similar DNA sequences. So it seems like mitochondria and chloroplasts originated from their precursors, which were like bacteria that got engulfed by the ancestral eukaryotic cell and then those evolved into the 4 eukaryotic kingdoms that we have today. Okay, so now we're skipping this stuff in chapter 26. So plants. So these words charophytes. So life originates in the oceans or in freshwater. The first things that come onto land, so both plants and fungi come onto land, not together, but they're both types of life that originated in the water and then moved onto land. There's a bunch of adaptations you're going to have to deal with if you're living on land. Charophytes are algae today that are probably the closest relatives of land plants, in that when protists or plants moved onto land, they were probably charophyte-like things like what's pictured here. Notice the cladogram here. So the cladogram has fungi and animals common ancestor, charophyte algae, and plants have a common ancestor. So this is telling us, of course, they all have a common ancestor further back, but this is telling us that modern animals and fungi are closer related. Modern charophyte algae and plants are closer related than, say, plants and animals or fungi and protists. So what kingdom is closest to kingdom Animalia? The answer is kingdom fungi, okay? So this slide goes through 4 what are called derived traits of plants. These are 4 traits, 4 things that plants have that charophytes do not have. So these are things that would have been derived on the line that leads to plants after it diverged from charophytes. And we're going to go through each of these. Alternation of generations, we discussed this in a previous chapter. Multicellular dependent embryos, we'll discuss. Walled spores producing sporangia, we'll discuss. And things called apical meristems. So let's first go through alternation of generations. We did this in the chapter with meiosis, so this is hopefully a review. This is the idea that as you go through reproduction, you go through a haploid stage, a diploid stage, then repeat it. Remember, with humans, the only haploid stage is egg and sperm. The diploid multicellular stage is what's dominant, right? So plants also have an alternation of generations. The stage that is haploid is called the gametophyte. The stage that is diploid is called the sporophyte. We don't use these terms to discuss people, but if we did, with people, the gametophyte would be egg and sperm, and the sporophyte would be the multicellular thing that's watching this video right now, right? Gametophytes produce gametes, sporophytes produce spores in plants. Then each generation produces the next generation. So we saw this diagram back in chapter, I think it's 11, the chapter that does meiosis. So it's about half and half, right? With humans, the sort of green color half of this diagram was very, very small, which is only egg and sperm. So let's start here. So I have gametes, egg and sperm, fuse and fertilization to get a diploid zygote. This is nothing new. That diploid zygote goes through mitosis and grows into, in this case, a fern, right? Now, if this were humans, cells of the human will go through meiosis to produce egg and sperm, and then you're right back here. With plants, it's different. The fern, in this case, the sporophyte, those cells go through meiosis to produce not gametes, but to produce spores. The spores then go through mitosis to grow into a multicellular haploid thing. This little heart-shaped thing, usually if you have ferns and you look like in the soil, they're not very big. They're on the surface of the soil. But these things they're multicellular. You can see them with the naked eye. This part is asexual because making the spores through meiosis, that was a sexual part of the life cycle because it's creating haploid cells from diploid cells. But when these things grow through mitosis to produce the gametophyte, that's asexual. All right. Now, at this point, the gametophyte needs to produce gametes. Well, how do you produce gametes from things that are already haploid? You just go through mitosis. So you go through mitosis, produce gametes, 2 gametes from different plants fuse in fertilization to form a zygote. And then you keep repeating the cycle over and over and over again. That's what alternation of generations is. Everything, fungi do it, plants do it, animals do it. This isn't unique to plants. You just need to understand that this first appears when life goes from water onto the land, this is one of these adaptations that, charophytes don't do this, protists don't do this. Plants do this, animals do this, fungi can do it. Okay, on the AP exam, they wouldn't expect you to be able to draw this, but if they gave it to you, you should be able to explain it or answer questions about it. The next three derived traits are relatively short, so I put them all on one slide. Multicellular dependent embryos. So, I mean, you have, this is the same as with animals. You have a diploid embryo, a zygote grows into an embryo, right? That's contained inside tissues of the female. This is going to lead to how it works in animals too, right? With protists, you don't have embryos. So walled spores producing sporangia. So, the gametophyte produces gametes. The sporophyte produces spores. There's also multicellular organisms in the sporophyte, multicellular organs in the sporophyte that produces spores. You don't have these because you don't produce spores. You just produce gametes like egg or sperm. But plants have specialized structures. Let me go back a second. So here is, the walled spores producing sporangia. Here's where you're producing spores. They have organs called sporangia. Here's where you produce gametes. They have organs called gametangia. Apical meristems, you just need to know what these are. So apical meristems are regions usually at the tip of the shoot, the top of the plant, or the tips of the roots, the bottom of the plant, where they're going through lots of mitosis. Apical means like the tip. Meristems, as a term, that kind of means like embryonic tissues, sort of. And think about it, plants grow fast upward and grow fast downward, right? So apical meristems are regions going through lots of mitosis for the plant to grow. So now we're going to briefly go through four what we call stages of, plants originating from protists in the water. Moving on land, there's four sort of distinct stages in plants taking over the land, right? Because plants own the land, right? So things you have to deal with: dehydration. If you're in the water, if you're surrounded by water, you're not going to dehydrate. Well, plants can dehydrate. So a waxy cuticle, think like a cactus leaf. A waxy cuticle prevents dehydration. Stomata, those pores on the underside of leaves, they can open and close that allow for gas exchange. You can close them if it's too hot. That's an adaptation to prevent dehydration. Gametangia, again, that's where you're producing your gametes. One reason you have them protected so that they don't dry out. Vascular tissues, this is a very important term. Remember back in chapter whatever, when we discussed xylem and phloem in plant, xylem carried water, usually up the plant, and phloem carried nutrients. It was from source to sink, but generally down the plant. Vascular tissues are transport tissues found in plants. You have a cardiovascular system. Vascular just means transport. Your cardiovascular system is your heart and your blood vessels and your capillaries, right? Plants have vascular tissues. Xylem carries water, phloem carries sugars, all right? We discussed xylem back when we were doing water in chapter 2? When we did adhesion and cohesion of water, how it gets sucked up a plant. Those were xylem vessels we were discussing way back in chapter 2, I think it was. So this is the first stage. They had to find ways to prevent dehydrating. The next 4 stages we can go through quickly. The diversification of vascular plants. So can you think of a plant? I'll tell you the answer. Can you think of a plant that's a very basic plant, but does not have vascular tissues, does not have xylem or phloem? I'll give you an example. Moss. Moss is a very primitive plant. Moss is definitely a plant. Moss doesn't have xylem or phloem. So moss is non-vascular. And moss obviously had to live in areas that are decently damp, right? You're not going to have moss in a desert. The next stage is the diversification of vascular plants. So vascular plants, think like a fern. Ferns all over the planet. Well, they're widely distributed throughout the planet. Think of it that way. Vascular plants take over because they can live pretty far away from land or from the water, right? Because they have adaptations to prevent water loss. I didn't mention roots. Roots is also, we could add roots to this list. Roots is an adaptation to prevent water loss because you absorb water through root hairs. I should add roots to this slide. Now, the third stage is the development of the seed. So first we had moss, non-vascular. Then we had ferns. I'm giving just one example. There's more examples. Ferns are vascular, but ferns don't have seeds. Ferns just produce spores. So now we have the development of the seed. So the seed is great because in the seed you have an embryo, an embryonic plant. You have stored foodstuffs, and you have a protective coating. Plants that produce seeds. Now the last stage is going to be the flower. So these are plants that produce seeds but don't have flowers yet. They're called gymnosperms. The root gymno means naked. So it's like a seed without a flower around it is a naked seed. Gymnosperms, think like pine trees, oak trees, things that produce seeds that don't have flowers. They take over the planet too. They're very well adapted for life on land, and their seeds, have good adaptations to prevent dehydration. The last stage is the emergence of flowering plants. Flowering plants are called angiosperms. So gymnosperms have seeds, no flowers. Angiosperms have seeds and flowers, and angiosperms, also take over the planet. Once you get angiosperms, you have a kind of a unique coevolution between angiosperms and insects. And in some cases, birds too, because oftentimes insects only, so what do plants need to spread pollen? Well, the wind will spread pollen, right? But insects are great because insects will go from one flower to another. So they'll directly take pollen between flowers. And there's certain kinds of insects that only go to one type of flower. So once you have, you don't have lots of angiosperms on the plant, so you have lots of insects and vice versa. I'm not sure which actually came first. I'm going to guess insects came first, but I'm not positive that's correct. But in the course of the history of life on Earth, you get this explosion of angiosperms around the same time that you get this huge diversity of insects. It's called coevolution because they evolve sort of together because they rely on each other. So let's just review this. So non-vascular plants are things like a moss. Then you get vascular plants that don't have seeds, like a fern. Then you get vascular plants that have seeds, which are called gymnosperms, like a pine tree. Then you get vascular plants that have seeds and flowers, which are called angiosperms, like a rose or a tulip or a daisy. Pick any flower that you like, okay? So that's plants. So the end of chapter 26 goes to kingdom fungi, and we're gonna not talk a lot about fungi. So fungi are all eukaryotic, as is everything in these three chapters. They're all mostly multicellular. They're all heterotrophic. They have to ingest food. Usually they absorb nutrients from the soil that they're in. They produce enzymes to help break down their food source. So there's three main sort of, nutritional modes of fungi. So saprobes are things that absorb nutrients from a non-living host. So think it could be something that was living but it's dead. Like think of a rotting stump of a log, and you have a mushroom growing on it. Parasitic are things that derive nutrients from a living host. Mutualistic would be something that gets things from a living host but reciprocates. That also benefits whatever the host is. These three words, are not limited to fungi. You can have parasites that are animals, but they describe the way fungi get nutrition. The basic structure of a fungi. So this word hyphae. So hyphae are these little minute threads that kind of surround the plasma membrane, and the hyphae can also extend into the soil. This word mycelium. So you see how you can have a network of hyphae. Here's a diagram. Here's an actual picture. The hyphae go into the soil. They can grow around plant roots. The more hyphae you have, or the bigger your mycelial network is, it increases the surface area of the hyphae, and having more surface area means you can absorb more stuff from the soil. So you wouldn't call these roots. They're not roots in the nature that plants have roots, but they're sort of like a root in that they're a feeding unit, and they can extend out of the fungus and into the soil. Here's a mycelium. Here's another one. Other fungal adaptations. So sometimes fungal hyphae will actually bore into other cells. This sounds like a parasite, but in this case, it doesn't have to be a parasite. Haustoria are hyphae that are going into other cells, particularly plants. we've said many times, fungi have cell walls made of chitin, not cellulose or peptidoglycan like plants or bacteria. That's made of chitin, which is a polysaccharide, a carbohydrate. Chitin contains nitrogen, which is interesting. Two fungi of note. So lichens, like what grows on trees. Lichens, both of these on this slide are symbiotic relationships between something and a fungus, and they're both mutualistic. So lichens are fungi that grow along with protist, and you've seen these on trees before. So it's an association between a fungus and a protist, and they're so closely associated, usually they're classified as one organism, even though it's actually part fungus, part protist. Mycorrhizae is a symbiotic relationship also between a fungus, but in this case with plant roots. So this kind of goes back to what is shown in this diagram on the previous slide. So mycorrhizae are when the fungal hyphae actually like bore into plant cells in some cases, and it benefits both. The mycorrhizae, look at the surface area of the mycorrhizae here. Here's the plant root, right? That one thing, and mycorrhizae is around it. So all the nutrients that the fungus absorbs from the soil, some of that gets transferred to the plant. So the plant's happy. The plant also will divert some of its carbohydrate stores from photosynthesis to the fungus, so they both benefit. These next two slides, these are super important. This stuff's pretty simple. So the ecological importance of fungi and plants are huge to planet Earth. Fungi, along with bacteria probably more so, are Earth's primary decomposers. You should be able to list 3 or 4 of these on an essay from memory. Lichens break down rock and soil, things like topsoils created by mosses or lichens that first break up rocks. Plant roots hold soil in place to prevent erosion. That's great. Decaying plant parts add nutrients to the soil. That's fantastic. Let's do some more. Let's not forget plants produce O2 gas. Remember, some protists can too, but we moved on from protists. Releasing O2 gas is very important for us animals that need O2 gas. Plants influence the evolution of animals. Remember, we discussed the coevolution between pollinators, insects, and birds, and flowering plants. Plants, nitrogen and carbon cycling. Carbon cycling is talking about photosynthesis. Like we can't turn CO2 into sugars, plants can. Nitrogen cycling, nitrogen fixation. Remember, plants don't do that. What does nitrogen fixation? Bacteria do it, but some plants have those nodules in the roots that house the bacteria. So plants are useful for nitrogen fixation because they house the bacteria. And obviously lots of things, not just humans, lots of animals eat plants. So that's an important ecological contribution plants make to Earth. Okay, that was 26. 27, we're gonna do super fast. So 27 is on Kingdom Animalia. What's an animal? There's always exceptions to every rule. Some general traits. All animals are multicellular. There's no single-celled animals. They're heterotrophic. They have to ingest food. They typically store carbohydrates as some kind of starch versus cellulose. Animal cells don't have cell walls. I don't think any animals have cell walls. Nervous and muscle tissues unique to animals. Not every animal has muscle tissue, but if it has muscle tissue, it's definitely an animal. Most reproduce sexually. Some lower animals, like a sponge or a coral, some of those can reproduce asexually, or like a hydra does the budding stuff. All animals can produce sexually. It says most, but all animals can reproduce sexually. Some can do both. The diploid stage is dominant. The last slide we're going to do on this whirlwind of 3 chapters. So the typical reproductive scheme of animals. So you have a flagellated sperm, usually fertilizing an egg that's immobile. Sometimes the eggs can be flagellated, especially if it's reproducing in the water. When coral reefs produce egg and sperm, which they do in the ocean, they're releasing egg and sperm. The eggs are actually flagellated. Once you get higher in animal classification, the eggs become immobile. Then you get a zygote that's diploid. This is not new. The zygote undergoes cleavage, which is just a series of repeated mitotic divisions. So here I had a zygote, it went through mitosis. Here it shows the 8-cell stage, then you have 16 and 32 and whatnot. After you have lots of cleavage, you get this stage called the blastula. A blastula is a ball of cells that's hollow in the middle, right? The blastula stage is hollow. once you get the blastula stage, basically the embryo undergoes what's called gastrulation. See how it forms this like pinching in? This pinching in is going to eventually go all the way to the other side of the embryo. And the little like tube that you form is your gut, it's your digestive system. Depending upon the animal, it depends, but where it first pinched in might be the mouth or the anus. And the other end, where it finishes, the tube is the mouth or anus, depending upon what the other one wasn't. For humans, the pinching in, that pocket becomes your anus, and the other end becomes your mouth. So basically, this tube becomes your digestive system, which, you know, one end is the mouth, the other end is the anus. All the organs in between develop from this tube that's formed within the hollow ball. Okay, all right, so that was 3 chapters in one video. If you want to know more about the classification of animals or protists or plants, read 25, 26, or 27. But the things we need to know for the AP exam are what we discussed in this video. All right, that was definitely enough. Hope that was helpful, and I will see you guys next time.